"Sir, can I sit with you just until my leg stops shaking?" That whisper from a 9-year-old boy standing alone in a diner full of strangers was about to change everything. Not just for him, for every single person in that room. If you've ever been the one nobody looked at, the one they looked through, stay right here. This story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this little boy's story can travel. The bell above the diner door had rung hundreds of times that Tuesday. It rang when the lumber workers came in stomping mud off their boots. It rang when the church ladies arrived with their umbrellas and their opinions. It rang when the couple from the motel down the street slipped inside to share a piece of pie and pretend they weren't fighting. But when it rang at 4:47 in the afternoon, and a small boy limped through the doorway with water pouring off the brim of a torn baseball cap, soaking through shoes that had a hole in the left toe, nobody looked up. Not one person in Millie's Corner Diner turned their head. Nobody asked if he was okay. Nobody moved a single inch. Luke Calloway was 9 years old. He was 4 feet 4 inches tall. He weighed 61 pounds, which was about 15 pounds less than a healthy boy his size should weigh. His right arm had a cast on it, pale blue, once now gray and crumbling at the edges. And the cast had been there long enough that the original marker drawings on it had faded to ghost lines. His left leg carried a tremor that hadn't stopped in 3 days. He'd been running, walking, hiding, and running again ever since Thursday night, when his uncle had locked him in the storage shed behind the house and forgotten to come back. He hadn't forgotten. He'd just stopped caring. Luke stood inside the diner entrance for a moment, dripping onto the black and white linoleum. The warmth hit him like a wall, warm grease, warm coffee, the low murmur of people who had somewhere to be and someone to go home to. His stomach cramped so hard he bent slightly at the waist. He hadn't eaten since the half bag of crackers he'd found behind the gas station dumpster on Saturday morning. His lips were cracked. His eyes had that particular look that children only get when they've been frightened for too long. Not scared anymore exactly, just permanently braced. Like flinching had become his resting face. He straightened up. He adjusted the broken strap of the small backpack on his shoulder. And then Luke Calloway looked across that diner with the kind of quiet, desperate calculation that no 9-year-old should ever have to know how to do. He was looking for a safe place to sit. The first booth on his left held 4 men, big men construction or logging by the looks of the dried mud caked onto their work pants. One of them was laughing so hard at something his buddy said that he slapped the table and made all the coffee cups rattle. Luke took a step toward them and then stopped. One of the men had a voice that was too loud and a laugh that was too sharp, and something in Luke's chest recognized the pattern, the volume, the unpredictability of it, and his feet simply refused to carry him forward. He backed away before he'd even gotten close enough for them to notice him. The second booth had an elderly woman with white hair set in tight curls sitting across from a girl who looked about 5 years old, all ribbons, and fidgeting. Luke thought grandmothers were safe. Grandmothers were supposed to be safe. His own grandmother, before she died, used to press butterscotch candies into his palm and call him her little shadow. He limped toward this woman with something close to hope rising in his throat. "Excuse me, ma'am." His voice came out smaller than he intended. The woman looked up. Her eyes traveled down from his face to his cast, to his soaked shoes, to the trembling in his leg. And then, and Luke would remember this moment for the rest of his life, her expression didn't soften. It shuddered, like a window being closed from the inside. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said, already looking back down at her menu. "We're waiting for someone." The little girl across from her stared at Luke with open, innocent curiosity. She raised her hand and gave him a small wave. Luke didn't wave back. He just turned around. The third option was a booth near the middle of the diner, 3 people in their Sunday clothes Bibles on the table beside the ketchup and the sugar shaker. Luke had gone to church once with a foster family 2 placements ago. He remembered it as a place where people said things they didn't mean and meant things they didn't say. But still, 3 people with Bibles had to account for something, didn't they? He stood at the edge of their table for almost 20 seconds. 20 full seconds, which is a very long time to be invisible. Not one of them looked up. One of the women reached past her Bible to take a sip of her coffee. Her elbow came within 6 inches of Luke's arm. She didn't notice him. Or she noticed him and made the choice, the quiet, easy, cowardly choice, not to. Luke's jaw tightened. He'd seen that choice made before. He knew exactly what it looked like from the outside. What it felt like was something else entirely. He pulled back from their table and stood in the middle of the diner for a moment that felt much longer than it was. His leg was shaking harder now. His backpack felt like it was filled with stones, though there was almost nothing in it, just the brass key tag, a damp notebook, and a photograph he couldn't look at anymore but couldn't throw away. He pressed his crutch harder into the floor to steady himself and looked toward the back of the room. That was when he saw the man in the corner. He was sitting alone. He was big, not just tall, but wide, the kind of wide that comes from years of physical work and not apologizing for the space you take up. He had a dark beard going gray at the chin, hands wrapped around a coffee cup like the cup owed him something. He was wearing a black leather vest over a gray shirt, and on the back of that vest, Luke couldn't see it from here, but he'd see it later, was a patch that half the people in this diner had already clocked and instinctively put as much distance between themselves and as the room allowed. Hell's Angels. But Luke Calloway didn't know about patches and chapters and the complicated, loaded history of what that logo meant to the outside world. What Luke Calloway knew was this: the man was alone. The man was quiet. The man wasn't performing anything for anyone. He was just sitting there eating his pie, not bothering a single soul in the room, and the booth across from him was empty. Luke started walking toward him. His crutch clicked on the linoleum. A few heads turned. He could feel the weight of people's attention on the back of his neck. Not concern, just the particular radar that humans have for things that seem out of place. A wet, limping boy crossing a diner to approach a Hell's Angel qualified as out of place. Luke felt their eyes and kept walking anyway because he had run out of other options, and his leg had not stopped shaking, and he had been cold and alone and scared for 3 days, and sometimes you run out of other options, and you just walk toward the one thing that doesn't look away from you. The man's name was Jack Davidson. Most people had called him Bull since he was 19 years old and had knocked a running back flat during a pickup game outside Bakersfield with nothing but his shoulder and forward momentum. Bull Davidson was 53 years old. He had a grown daughter in Sacramento he was trying to have a better relationship with. He had a record sealed now, mostly from his 20s, that he didn't talk about at church, not that he went to church. He had a code, though, Everybody who'd ever ridden with him knew he had a code. Bull's code was simple, and it never changed. You don't lie, you don't steal from your own, and you don't walk past someone smaller than you who needs something. He'd noticed the boy the moment the bell above the door rang. He'd watched all 3 rejections without expression. When the church ladies didn't look up for 20 seconds, Bull had set down his fork. When the boy turned around and stood in the middle of the room with that particular look on his face, that look of a child rearranging their understanding of the world into something colder and more accurate, Bull had pushed his pie plate a few inches to the side. He was ready when the boy reached his table. Luke stopped at the edge of the booth. He looked at the big man. The big man looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and in that moment the entire diner seemed to hold its breath without meaning to. "Sir," Luke said. His voice was steadier than he expected it to be. He had decided somewhere between the church ladies' table and this one that he was not going to sound like he was begging. He was going to ask. There was a difference. "Can I sit with you just until my legs stop shaking?" Bull looked at him for one more second, then he reached out his booted foot and nudged the opposite bench outward, not a shove, just a gesture, the way you'd hold a door open for someone. An invitation that asked nothing in return. Luke sat down. He set his crutch carefully against the wall beside him. He shrugged his backpack off one shoulder and held it in his lap. He did not say thank you right away, which surprised Bull. He just sat there for a moment, breathing the way someone sits when they've been running so long that sitting itself feels like a skill they have to remember how to perform. Then very quietly, Luke said, "Thank you." Bull said. He picked up his fork again. Millie herself came over. She owned the place, had owned it for 22 years, knew every regular by their order and their trouble. She looked at the boy. She looked at Bull. She looked at the boy again. "What can I get you, honey?" Luke looked up at her. His hands tightened on the backpack strap. "I don't have any money." Millie's face did something complicated. She glanced at Bull. Bull didn't look up from his pie. "He'll have whatever he wants. Put it on mine." "I don't want to," Luke started, Burger and fries, Bull said, still to Millie, and a chocolate milk. Luke opened his mouth, closed it. His throat moved. Okay, he said finally. Millie wrote it down and walked away without making a production of it, which was one of the reasons Bull had been eating at this diner for 11 years. She understood that some moments needed to be handled with a light touch and no audience. For a few minutes they sat in silence. Bull ate his pie. Luke held his backpack and watched the rain streak down the window beside their booth. The trembling in his legs slowed, then mostly stopped. The warmth of the diner, the simple fact of being seated, of having an actual destination, it began to work on him the way warmth always works on cold things, gradually, and then all at once. What happened to your arm? Bull asked. He wasn't looking at Luke when he said it. He was still looking at his pie. Luke looked down at the cast. Fell. Bull cut another piece of pie with his fork. That cast looks about 4 months old. Oh, Luke said nothing. That's a long time for a kid to be walking around with a broken arm without getting a new cast. Out of silence, Bull ate his pie. He didn't push. This was something he'd learned a long time ago from a man he respected, who told him once that the secret to getting people to talk was simple. You stopped trying to make them talk. You just stayed. And you waited. Millie brought the burger and fries. She set the chocolate milk down and gave Luke a straw. He pulled it out of the paper wrapper with both hands, the cast making his right hand clumsy, and he ate. He tried to eat slowly. He'd learned the hard way what happened when you ate too fast after not eating for too long, and he had enough problems without adding that one. But the burger was warm and real, and it tasted like the best thing he'd ever put in his mouth. And by the third bite, he was eating faster than he meant to. Bull watched this out of the corner of his eye and felt something go quiet and hard inside his chest. He'd seen hungry before. He'd been hungry before, not as a child, but as a young man making bad choices, choosing pride over practical sense. But a hungry child was a different thing entirely. A hungry child eating like they don't know when the next meal is coming is one of those particular sights that does something irreversible to a man who still has a conscience. Bull set his fork down completely. He laced his fingers on the table and looked out the window. Around them, the diner had mostly resumed its noise. The lumber workers were still laughing. The elderly woman was cutting her granddaughter's pancake into small pieces. The church ladies had opened their Bibles. Nobody was looking at the corner booth anymore. This was, Bull thought, both the best and the worst thing about people. What's your name? He asked. The boy looked up. There was ketchup on his chin. Luke. How old are you, Luke? 9. A pause. And a half. Where are your parents? The question landed differently than Bull intended it to. He saw Luke's jaw tighten, saw him swallow something that wasn't food. My mom died when I was 4, Luke said. His voice was flat and careful, the way you make your voice when you've said a hard thing so many times it's worn smooth. My dad's not in the picture. I live with my uncle. And where does your uncle think you are right now? Luke looked at him for a long moment. This was the question, wasn't it? This was the real question. Under all the other questions, this was the one that connected the broken cast to the limp, to the rain-soaked shoes, to the hollow look behind his eyes. He doesn't think about me that much, Luke said. So probably not anywhere. Bull held the boy's gaze. He didn't flinch from it, which Luke noticed. Most adults, when they heard something they didn't want to hear from a kid, found somewhere else to look. This man was still looking right at him, still present. Not alarmed, not skeptical, not searching for the comfortable interpretation. Just looking. How long have you been out? Bull asked. Low voice. Careful. Luke considered lying. He was good at lying. He'd had to get good at it, the way kids in his situation always did, because the truth had a way of making things worse, and the lie was at least predictable. But something about this man's steadiness, the way he was just sitting there with no bend visible anywhere on his face, something made the lie feel heavier than usual, like it would cost him more than it was worth. Since Thursday, Luke said. Bull was quiet for a moment. Thursday was 4 days ago. This boy had been alone for 4 days in November in this part of the state, where it dropped to 42 degrees at night. Okay, Bull said, just that. Not that's terrible, not poor kid. Not the performative shock and hand-wringing that Luke had learned to distrust, because it was almost always about making the adult feel better, rather than actually helping him. Just okay. I hear you. I'm still here. Luke ate another bite of his burger. There's something I need to show you, Luke said. His voice had changed, slightly more deliberate now. Less like a boy looking for warmth and more like a knight who had been carrying something and had decided in this particular moment, with this particular person, that he was ready to set it down. He reached into his backpack. His hand came out holding a brass key tag, the kind that motels use, the heavy, old-fashioned kind with the room number stamped into the metal. The number on it was 14. On the back, in small raised letters, were the words, Larkspur Motor Lodge. He set it on the table between them. Bull looked at it. He didn't touch it. "What's at room 14, Bull asked. Luke looked down at the key tag, then back up. His eyes were dry. He was past the stage where crying came easily, that too had been trained out of him slowly and without mercy over the past 2 years. "Proof," Luke said, "that my uncle has been taking my money." Bull's expression didn't change on the surface, but something behind his eyes shifted, a recalibration. He was upgrading his assessment of what he was dealing with. This wasn't a runaway. This wasn't a kid who'd had a fight with a guardian and bolted on impulse. This was something more deliberate, something that had been thought through by a 9-year-old who'd had 4 days alone in the cold to organize his thoughts into something he could use. "Your money," Bull said. "My mom left me money," Luke said. "A trust. My uncle is my trustee. He's been taking from it. I found the papers." His jaw worked. "He found out I found the papers. That's why he locked me in the shed." The lumber workers at the far booth burst out laughing again. The sound cracked across the diner like something breaking. Luke flinched hard, his whole body going rigid for 1 second before he got it back under control. Bull saw it, filed it away, said nothing about it. "The shed," Bull repeated. "There's no heat in it. He took the lock off from the outside, the kind you can't open from in." Luke's voice was still flat, still careful, but something was fraying slightly at the edges. Now the way a rope frays when it's been under too much tension for too long. "He said he'd only let me out when I agreed to stop asking about the money. He said if I told anyone, nobody would believe me anyway because I'm a kid and he's an adult, and adults always believe adults." He stopped. He looked at Bull with those worn, smooth eyes. "He was probably right about that," Luke said. "Most adults." Bull looked at the boy for a long, steady moment. Then he looked at the brass key tag still sitting between them on the table. Then he looked back at Luke. "Not all of them," Bull said. And something in Luke's face, something carefully constructed and long practiced, cracked. Just slightly, just at the corners. He pressed his lips together and looked down at his fries, and his hand came up and pressed flat against the table like he needed to feel something solid. He wasn't crying, he was just breathing. And Bull Davidson sat across from him and didn't say another word and didn't look away. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do for someone who's been invisible is simply to be the one who sees them. Outside the diner windows, the rain kept falling. Inside, the coffee got refilled, and the church ladies closed their Bibles, and the lumber workers finally settled down into the comfortable quiet of full stomachs and nowhere pressing to be. The diner clock ticked over to 5 o'clock, and Millie turned the open sign so the neon bled a little less desperately into the wet street. In the back corner booth, a 9-year-old boy with a fraying cast and a brass key tag and 4 days of cold and fear sitting in his bones was eating the rest of his burger and fries. And across from him, a man that most of the room had been quietly afraid of since the moment he sat down was refilling his own coffee from the carafe Millie had left on the table, and he was thinking with the particular methodical focus of a man who has learned that thinking before acting is the difference between solving problems and creating new ones about what exactly he was going to do next. The brass key tag caught the diner light and threw a small gold gleam across the table between them. "Room 14 at the Larkspur Motor Lodge." "Proof," the boy had said. Bull looked at it for a long moment. Then he reached into the chest pocket of his leather vest and pulled out his phone. Luke watched him. His hand tightened slightly on his backpack strap. "Who are you calling?" he asked. And the wariness in his voice was so old and so practiced that it hurt to hear coming out of a 9-year-old's mouth. Bull met his eyes, held them. "Someone who can help," Bull said. "But I'm going to tell you something first." He set the phone down on the table face up, not yet dialing. "You came and sat at my table. You showed me that key. That means you made a choice tonight to trust somebody." He paused. "I'm not going to make you sorry for that choice. You hear me?" Luke looked at him for a long time. The trembling in his leg, the one that had driven him through a full diner of strangers until he found this one quiet corner, it had stopped completely. "Okay," Luke said, very quietly. "Okay." Bull picked up the phone. Bull's thumb hovered over the contact name for exactly 3 seconds before he pressed it. The phone rang twice. Then a voice answered, deep, unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned a long time ago that volume was for people who weren't sure they'd be listened to. "Bull." Not a question. Dean Stone didn't ask questions when he already knew the shape of the answer. "I need you," Bull said. "Nothing else. Just that." A pause. "We're Millie's. And Dean, bring it quiet. This isn't a situation, it's a kid." Another pause, longer this time. "How bad?" Bull looked at Luke across the table. The boy had gone very still, watching Bull's face the way animals watch something they're not sure about, reading, tone reading, expression, calculating distance in case they needed to move fast. "Bad enough," Bull said. 20 minutes. 15, Dean said and hung up. Bull put the phone face down on the table. Luke was still watching him. "That man you called," Luke said carefully, "is he safe?" And Bull noticed something in that question that most adults would have missed entirely. The boy hadn't asked who he was or what he did or why Bull trusted him. He'd asked one specific targeted thing. Is he safe? Because safe was the only currency Luke had left that meant anything. "Yeah," Bull said. "He's safe." Luke nodded slowly, like he was filing that away rather than fully believing it. He reached for his chocolate milk and took a long drink through the straw. "My uncle used to say he was safe too," Luke said, not looking up. "In the beginning." The words hit the table like a stone dropped in still water. Bull didn't respond immediately. He let the ripple settle. "Tell me about the beginning," he said. Luke turned the chocolate milk cup in a slow circle with his good hand. "When my mom died, there wasn't anybody else. My Uncle Rick is my mom's brother. He was nice at first. He came to her funeral in a real suit and everything. He cried." Luke's mouth twisted slightly. "I remember thinking, okay, this man cried at my mom's funeral. That means he loved her. That means he's probably going to love me too." He stopped turning the cup. "It took about 4 months," Luke said, "before it changed." "What changed first?" Bull asked. "The way he looked at me," Luke said, "like I was something he was keeping track of. Like I was a number on a spreadsheet." He paused. "I didn't know what a spreadsheet was back then. I do now. I found one. In his desk. In a folder with my name on it." Bull's jaw moved slightly. He said nothing. "My mom's trust is worth $240,000, Luke said, and he said it the way a child says something they've memorized because the number itself is too big and too abstract to fully understand just repeating the shape of it. I'm not supposed to get it until I'm 25. Uncle Rick controls it until then. There's supposed to be a statement every year sent to a lawyer, except the lawyer retired." Luke looked up, and Uncle Rick picked the new one. There it was. Bull leaned back slowly. He was connecting things, the timeline, the escalation, the shed, the cast, that hadn't been replaced in 4 months, and the picture assembling itself was not complicated. It was, in fact, very simple. The simplest kind of evil usually was. "The key tag," Bull said. "Room 14, and what exactly is in that room?" Luke reached into his backpack again. This time he pulled out a small notebook, damp at the corners, the cover warped from the rain. He set it on the table and opened it carefully the way you'd handle something fragile. "I wrote down everything I found," Luke said. "Account numbers, transfer dates. I copied them out of the spreadsheet. I didn't know if I'd be able to get back to the desk, so I wrote it all down." He looked at the notebook. "And I took photographs. With Uncle Rick's old phone, he forgot it was even in the drawer. I put the photos on a memory card, and I put the memory card in an envelope, and I hid it." He tapped the key tag. "In there." Bull looked at the notebook, at the key tag, at this 9-year-old boy who had been locked in a cold shed, and who had, before the shed, in the narrow window between discovering the truth and being caught discovering it, had the presence of mind to document everything, copy it, photograph it, and secure it in an off-site location. "How long were you planning this?" Bull asked. Luke considered the question seriously, the way he considered all questions. "About 6 weeks, he said. "After I found the spreadsheet the first time. He didn't know I'd seen it. I put everything back exactly like it was, and I started thinking about what to do." His voice was measured. I knew if I had just told someone, it would be my word against his. I needed proof they couldn't argue with. So I waited until I had it. Bull was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're 9." "9.5, Luke said. "Right." Bull ran a hand over his beard. 9.5. He shook his head, not in disbelief, but in something closer to respect. The specific, heavy respect a person feels when they're looking at someone who has survived something they shouldn't have had to survive, and survived it with more intelligence and grace than most adults would have managed. "Okay," Bull said, "here's what's going to happen next. Some people are going to come in, they're going to sit down, they're not going to make a scene, and they're not going to scare you. And then we're going to figure out together what the right next step is. But nothing happens without you agreeing to it. You understand?" Luke stared at him. "Why are you doing this?" "Doing what?" "Helping me. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Bull looked at the boy for a moment. "You asked," he said simply. Luke blinked. It seemed like the most straightforward answer he'd ever received from an adult, and possibly the most confusing because of it. He'd spent 2 years in a world where adults helped themselves first and helped children when it was convenient or when someone was watching. The concept of, "you asked, so I'm here," was so simple it almost didn't compute. "That's it," Luke said. "That's it," Bull said. "You asked for a seat. I gave you one. You showed me something that needed to be dealt with, so we're dealing with it." He picked up the carafe and refilled his coffee. "Finish your fries." Luke looked down at his plate. He ate a fries, then another. The trembling in his hands had mostly stopped now, too. The food, the warmth, the first adult in 4 days who hadn't looked through him. It was recalibrating something inside him, settling things that had been vibrating with fear for so long, they'd almost forgotten how to be still. He was on his last handful of fries when the diner bell rang. Not once, 4 times in rapid succession. Luke looked up fast. His hand went to his backpack strap, automatically that flinching bracing gesture, and then he saw who it was, and he didn't know whether to be reassured or more afraid, because the 4 men who came through Millie's door were each variations on the same theme as Bull. Large, leather, unhurried in the particular way that people are unhurried when they're completely confident that nothing in the room presents a threat to them. The diner went quiet. Not completely, the coffee cups still clinked, the kitchen still hummed, but the human noise dropped. Conversations became murmurs. Murmurs became nothing. The lumber workers watched from the corners of their eyes. The church ladies gripped their coffee cups. The 4 men moved through the room without looking at anyone except Bull. They pulled chairs from empty tables and arranged themselves around the corner booth in a loose semicircle. 2 chairs pulled up to the end, 1 man leaning against the wall, creating without any apparent planning a kind of physical boundary between the booth and the rest of the diner. The man in front pulled a chair up directly across from Bull and sat down. He was Bull's age, maybe slightly older, with close-cropped silver hair and gray eyes that moved across the table and landed on Luke with an expression that was completely neutral until something shifted in it, something that recognized what it was looking at and responded without performing. "Dean Stone," he said to Luke directly, not to Bull, to Luke. He extended a hand across the table. "You can call me Dean." Luke looked at the hand for a half-second, then he shook it. "Luke," he said. "Luke." Dean nodded. He looked at the notebook on the table, at the key tag, then at Bull briefly. Back to Luke. "Bull tells me you've had a rough few days." "Yeah," Luke said. "Are you hurt physically? I mean beyond." Dean gestured toward the cast. "I'm okay," Luke said. Then after a pause, with the honesty of someone who'd decided they were done managing other people's comfort, "My ribs hurt. On the right side, they've hurt for a while." Dean didn't react with alarm. He absorbed it. "Okay, we're going to have someone look at that." He turned to one of the men behind him. "Petey, call Doc Walsh." One of the men pulled out a phone without a word. "Who's Doc Walsh?" Luke asked immediately. "He's a doctor," Dean said. "Retired ER. He consults for us sometimes when we need someone discreet and fast. He's good. He's clean. He won't report anything until we know the full picture and you're ready." Luke absorbed this. "When you say consults, I mean we trust him and he trusts us," Dean said. "No complications." He paused. "Luke, I'm going to be straight with you, because I think you've probably had enough adults talking around you. You're in a situation that involves some legal complexity. The evidence you have is significant, but how it gets used matters. I want to make sure it gets used right. My uncle said nobody would believe me, Luke said. His eyes were steady on Dean's face, testing the reaction. Dean's expression didn't change. Your uncle is wrong, he said, flat and certain, no cushioning around it. And in about, he glanced at his watch. 45 minutes, he's going to start finding out exactly how wrong he is. Luke's breath shifted. Just slightly. What happens in 45 minutes? A friend of mine named Karen Howell shows up, Dean said. She's an investigator. She worked family crimes for 16 years. She does private work now, and she's very, very good at what she does. When she gets here, you tell her what you told Bull. You show her the notebook. You tell her about room 14. He leaned forward slightly. And then we let the people who know how to do this. Okay. Luke looked at Dean. He looked at Bull. He looked around the semicircle of men who had arranged themselves without discussion into something that felt remarkably like a wall between him and whatever was outside that diner door. He's going to be looking for me by now, Luke said. My uncle. He's going to know I didn't just run away. He's going to know I took something. His voice was still controlled, but something underneath it was rising. If he figures out where I am, he won't walk in here, Bull said. He said it without drama, without threat. Just a statement of physics, like saying water runs downhill. Luke looked at him, then at the four men around them. Then he looked toward the diner entrance, and for the first time since he'd walked through that door soaking wet and shaking, something in his posture changed. The held-in, compressed, small quality of it shifted just slightly into something that had a little more room to breathe. One of the men, the one leaning against the wall who hadn't spoken yet, who had a long scar along his jaw, and the kind of eyes that had seen a lot and decided not to comment on most of it, spoke up for the first time. Kid, he said. His voice was rougher than the others, more gravel and less polish. Nobody's getting to you tonight, I promise you that. Luke looked at him. You don't know my uncle. The man almost smiled, almost. No, but your uncle doesn't know us. The diner bell rang again. Everyone at the table looked up, but it wasn't Rick Holloway who came through the door. It was a woman mid-40s, short, dark hair, moving with the specific kind of efficiency that people develop when they've spent years walking into rooms that are already complicated. She wore no nonsense on her face and carried a plain bag over one shoulder. She scanned the room in under 3 seconds, located the table in the back corner, with its unusual configuration of large men around one small boy, and walked toward it without hesitation. She pulled up a chair, sat down, looked at Luke and said, I'm Karen, you must be Luke. No preamble, no setup, just arrival. Luke blinked. How do you know my name? Bull texted it to me on the way over, she said, dropping her bag on the table and unzipping it. I also know you're 9, you've been out for 4 days, you have a broken arm that needs a new cast, and you have evidence of financial abuse stored in a motel room 2 miles from here. She looked up from the bag. Anything I'm missing so far? Luke stared at her. Then to Bull's great surprise, the corner of the boy's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the first suggestion of one. My ribs, Luke said. They hurt. Doc Walsh is 5 minutes out, Karen said, already pulling a tablet from her bag. Okay, before he gets here, I need you to walk me through everything. Start from the beginning, not your whole life, just from when you found the spreadsheet. Take your time, don't leave anything out, and don't worry about whether it sounds believable. I'm not here to decide if it's believable. I'm here to figure out what we can prove. Luke straightened in his seat. He pulled the notebook toward him. His broken arm rested on the table, and his good hand opened the notebook to the first page where his own careful child's handwriting listed numbers and dates in neat columns. Okay, he said, and he started to talk. It took 22 minutes. Karen asked questions, pointed precise questions, the kind that filled in gaps without steering, that pulled out detail without pressure. At one point, she asked Luke to describe the folder he had found in the desk, and Luke described it in such specific detail, the color, the label, the exact position in the second drawers from the top, the fact that the staple on the first document was slightly crooked, and he'd been careful to put it back exactly that way, that Karen stopped typing for a moment and just looked at him. You've got a hell of a memory, she said. I had to, Luke said simply. That landed in the silence and stayed there. When he was done, Karen sat back and looked at her tablet. The table was quiet. Outside, a car drove past slowly and everyone watched it pass through the window. Everyone except Luke, who was watching Karen's face. The Larkspur Motor Lodge, Karen said. You said you put an envelope in a room there. Room 14, Luke said. I paid for 2 weeks with money I'd been saving. The desk clerk didn't ask questions. He paused. I told her it was for my grandfather. Bull made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. Karen was not smiling, but her eyes were doing something adjacent to it. How long ago did you do that? 3 weeks before he locked me in the shed, Luke said. I wanted to make sure it was safe before I did anything else. Karen looked at Dean. Dean looked at Bull. Bull was looking at Luke with an expression that had stopped trying to stay neutral about 10 minutes ago. Okay, Karen said. She closed her tablet. Here's where we are. What you have, if the memory card has what you say it has, is potentially a very solid fraud case. Financial abuse of a minor. Breach of fiduciary duty. Possible criminal neglect. The physical evidence, she glanced at his arm toward his ribs, adds a separate dimension. She folded her hands on the table. What I need to do tonight is 2 things. First, I need to get that envelope from room 14 before your uncle figures out it exists. Second, I need to get a formal statement from you in front of someone with the right credentials. Like the police? Luke asked. His voice tightened on the last word, involuntary. Karen caught it. You've had a bad experience with police. My uncle called them once, Luke said carefully. When I tried to tell the school counselor. He called them before I could say anything to them, and he told them I'd been acting out and making things up because I was having trouble adjusting since my mom died. His jaw was tight. They believed him. The table was very quiet. That's not going to happen this time, Karen said. Her voice was different now, not softer but more precise, more deliberate, like each word was being placed with care. Because this time, you're not a child alone trying to explain something to adults who are starting from a position of skepticism. This time you walk in with documentation, physical evidence, a corroborating witness. She gestured toward Bull and me. She paused. And I've testified in 41 criminal cases and I've never lost one. Luke looked at her for a long moment. He told me no one would fight for me, Luke said, because fighting for me would mean fighting against him, and adults don't do that. He was talking about the adults he knew, Karen said. The diner bell rang again, and Doc Walsh came through silver-haired reading glasses hanging from his collar, carrying a black bag that looked like it had been to war and back. He took in the table configuration without comment, pulled up the last empty chair, and looked at Luke with the direct but gentle efficiency of a man who had spent 30 years in emergency rooms and had learned how to be both thorough and kind at the same time. Where does it hurt? He asked Luke. And Luke, who had not let anyone examine him in 4 months, who had flinched from every adult hand that came near him, who had learned to protect himself by making himself small and invisible. Luke pulled up the edge of his shirt without being asked twice, because something in the last 40 minutes had shifted in him. Not all the way, not permanently, not yet. Healing like that takes longer than 40 minutes. But enough. Enough that he was letting people in one careful inch at a time. Doc Walsh's expression didn't change as he examined the boy, but his hands as he pressed gently along Luke's ribcage were extraordinarily careful. And when Luke winced at the 4th rib on the right side and Doc Walsh said quietly, I know, buddy, I'm sorry. It was so matter-of-fact and so genuinely meant that Luke had to look at the table and breathe through his nose for a moment to keep his face from doing something he'd decided a long time ago he wouldn't let it do in front of strangers. 2 cracked ribs, old Doc Walsh said to Karen, still calm, still clinical. He looked at Luke's arm. This cast needs to come off and be replaced, possibly rebroken and reset depending on how it healed. He looked at Luke. How long ago did this happen? 4 months, Luke said. Doc Walsh nodded like he'd already known the answer. Okay, here's what we're going to do. And that was the moment the diner door opened and a man walked in who was not a biker, was not a doctor, was not an investigator, and was not anyone Luke had asked for. He was tall. He had sandy blonde hair and a blue jacket, and the particular expression of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room he walked into. He had mud on his shoes, which meant he'd been somewhere unpaved recently, and he was scanning the diner with the quick, calculating look of someone conducting a search. Luke saw him first. Every cell in his body fired at once. He went rigid. His good hand shot out and grabbed Bull's forearm across the table, grabbed it hard without thinking, without the careful, measured consideration he applied to every other action. "That's him," Luke whispered. "That's Uncle Rick." Bull didn't look toward the door right away. He looked at Luke's hand on his forearm, first at the white-knuckle grip, at the way the boy's entire body had gone from cautiously open to stone still in under a second, and that told him everything he needed to know before he turned his head at all. When he did turn, it was slow, deliberate. The way a man turns when he wants whoever he's looking at to know that he saw them coming and was not remotely concerned. Rick Holloway was scanning the diner from the entrance. His eyes moved in the pattern of a man looking for something specific. Not anxious, not panicked, but purposeful in the way of someone who was still operating under the assumption that he held all the cards. He hadn't spotted the back corner yet. The configuration of bodies around the booth was blocking his line of sight to Luke. Dean Stone, without turning around, said quietly to the man on his left, "Don't move. Don't stand. Everybody stays exactly where they are." Nobody moved. Bull put his hand over Luke's, over the small, rigid hand still gripping his forearm, and pressed down once firm and steady, the way you'd steady a shaking table. "Look at me," he said low and even. "Don't look at him. Look at me." Luke's eyes dragged away from the door and found Bull's face. His breathing was shallow and fast. "He can't touch you," Bull said. "You understand. Right now in this room, he cannot touch you. Not if you hear me." Luke nodded, a small, tight movement. "Good. Now keep your eyes here." Rick Holloway had started moving into the diner. His voice when it came was the voice of a man performing normalcy, warm on the surface, practiced the kind of voice that had gotten a lot of mileage from sounding reasonable. "Hey there," he said to no one in particular, addressing the room like he owned a piece of it. "Sorry to bother anyone. I'm looking for my nephew. 9 years old, got a cast on his arm. His name's Luke. He ran off this morning and I've been worried sick." He put a hand to his chest, that gesture, that particular to hand-to-chest gesture of the concerned guardian. "Any of you happen to see a little boy come through here?" Luke's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. Karen had already closed her tablet and slid it into her bag. Her face had gone completely neutral, not cold, not hostile, just blank and professional, in the way of someone who was running calculations. She looked at Dean. Dean gave a minimal shake of his head. "Not yet." Rick was working his way through the diner. The lumber workers shook their heads. The elderly woman pointed vaguely toward the door as if to say she hadn't seen anything. The church ladies looked at each other. He was getting closer to the back of the room, and the tone of his voice was still warm and worried uncle, but there was something underneath it, a tightness a precision to his scanning that belonged to a different kind of person than the one he was presenting. Luke was staring at the table. His good hand was flat against the linoleum, pressing down. "He's going to see me," Luke whispered. "Yes," Bull said, "and that's okay. It's not..." "Luke." Bull's voice was quiet, but it cut through. "He walked into our room. You understand what I'm saying? He walked into our room. That's the worst mistake he's made yet." Rick Hollandes had made it 2/3 of the way across the diner when he registered the cluster of men in the back corner. He slowed. His eyes moved across the leather vests, the patches, the particular posture of men who were not moving out of anyone's way. And then between two of those men, he saw the back of a small head, a baseball cap damp and tilted, and his entire effect changed. The warm voice went a register lower. "Luke." Luke's shoulders went up. Every muscle in his body responded to that voice the way a burn responds to heat with memory and contraction. Bull felt it through the table. He stood up, not fast, not aggressive. He just stood up, all 6'2" and 240 pounds of him, and turned to face Rick Holloway with the same unhurried calm he'd carried all evening. Like this was simply the next thing that was happening, and he had already decided how it was going to go. Rick stopped. He looked at Bull. He looked at the other men around the booth. He recalibrated. You could see it the way his expression shifted through several calculations before landing on something that still tried to be reasonable. "I'm just here for my nephew," Rick said. "He's a minor. He's my legal ward. I have every right." "Nobody said you don't," Bull said. His voice was completely calm. But he's in the middle of eating his dinner, so you can wait. Excuse me, Rick's voice went up slightly. I don't know who you think you are, but this is a family matter. I'm not asking your permission. I'm taking my nephew home. You're not doing anything yet, Bull said. You walked into a diner. You can stand there and let the boy finish his meal, or you can turn around and walk back out. Those are your two options right now. Rick stared at him. Something moved behind his eyes, not fear, not yet, but the first cold touch of the realization that this situation was not arranged the way he'd expected it to be. Luke, Rick said louder now, directing his voice past Bull toward the booth. Come on, buddy. I've been worried about you. Let's go home. Luke didn't move. Luke, sharper now, the warmth dropping in direct proportion to his patience. I said, let's go. He heard you, Karen said. She had stood up too, stepping out from the booth so Rick could see her clearly. She extended a business card toward him, between two fingers, holding it out the way you'd offer something to an animal you weren't sure about. Karen Howell, private investigator licensed in this state. I've been retained on Luke's behalf. If you'd like to discuss your nephew's situation, I'm happy to do that. But I need to advise you that anything you say right now can and will be documented. Rick looked at the card. He didn't take it. Retained by who? He's 9 years old. He can't retain anybody. Adults can retain investigators on behalf of children, Karen said. It happens all the time. Who? Rick demanded. Who retained you? I did, Bull said. Rick turned back to him. He was working hard to maintain the concerned uncle presentation, but the seams were showing. You don't know this boy. You don't know our family. You have no idea what has been going on, and you have no standing whatsoever to insert yourself into game. Rick. Dean Stone spoke for the first time. He was still sitting. He hadn't stood up, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't changed his posture in any way. But something about the way he said the name, the absence of any qualifier, the flatness of it, made Rick go still. Sit down. I'm not asking, Dean said. Same tone, same flatness, like gravity. Sit down. And Rick Holloway, who was taller than most of the men in this room, who had a law degree he never used, in a confident manner he used constantly, who had been managing people with words and performance for his entire adult life, sat down in the empty chair that one of Dean's men had pulled out without being asked. He sat down the way people sit down when something in the air has changed and their body understands it before their mind does. Luke had turned around in the booth. He was watching his uncle now. His face was impossible to read. It was the face of a child who had learned to be unreadable because readable had been used against him. But his eyes were doing something different, something that hadn't been there before tonight. He wasn't afraid, he was watching, steady and focused like someone who had been running from a storm for a long time and had finally found a structure solid enough to stand inside of and was now watching the storm from the window. You want to tell me what this is about, Rick said. He'd found his voice again quieter, now more controlled. The reasonable adult register. Because I've been looking for this boy for 4 days. 4 days. I called the police. I filed a missing persons report. I've driven every road in a 10-mile bayou. What time did you call the police? Karen asked. Rick looked at her. When you filed the missing persons report, what time was it? A pause. I don't remember exactly. Approximately, Karen said. Rick stopped. Why does that matter? Because Luke left the property Thursday evening, Karen said, and the missing persons report wasn't filed until Saturday afternoon. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. That's 36 hours, give or take, for a 9-year-old boy with a broken arm. She tilted her head slightly. Why did it take 36 hours to report a missing child, Mr. Holloway? The diner had gone completely quiet. Even the kitchen sounds had faded. Millie was standing in the pass-through, watching with a dish towel in her hands, making no attempt to pretend she wasn't. Rick's face was doing complicated things. I thought he had come back on his own. He'd done it before, run off when he was upset. I thought, he'd done it before, Bull said, stayed out late, came back. Rick was rebuilding as he spoke, patching gaps in real time. Kids do that. He gets upset and he takes off for a few hours. A 9-year-old with a broken arm, Bull said, who takes off for a few hours, and you wait 36 hours to call anyone. I'm not going to sit here and justify my parenting to him. Rick stopped himself. He looked around the table. He looked at the faces, Bull's steady, Karen's clinical, Dean's blank, Doc Walsh's quietly observing, and something in him shifted. The performance was costing more than it was producing. He changed tactics. Look, I can see something's been said here. I don't know what Luke told you, but he's had a hard couple of years. Since his mother passed, he has a tendency to exaggerate when he's upset. He sees things that aren't there and he's a liar, Luke said. Everyone looked at the boy. Luke had turned fully around in the booth now. He was looking at his uncle with an expression that was neither angry nor frightened. It was something colder and more deliberate. The expression of someone who has decided that the time for managing other people's comfort is over. That's what you're about to say, Luke said to Rick. He's a troubled kid. He exaggerates. He sees things. He has a hard time adjusting. His voice was completely steady. You practiced it. You said it to the police when I tried to tell the school counselor, and they believed you. And you looked at me that night and you said, "See how easy that was?" You said that. Rick's expression went through several things very quickly. Luke. Room 14, Luke said. Larkspur Motor Lodge. The name of the motel hit Rick Holloway like a physical impact. The color didn't drain from his face. It was more precise than that. It was more like watching someone's entire self-presentation collapse inward, the way a structure collapses when you remove the load-bearing wall. For just a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, Rick Holloway's face showed exactly what was underneath everything he'd been performing. Fear, clean, cold, and real. Then it was gone, replaced by something harder. I don't know what you're talking about. I have photographs, Luke said, of your spreadsheet, of the account transfers. I have the account numbers, the dates, and the amounts. I have 17 months of records. He reached into his backpack and put the notebook on the table. And I have it all written down right here in case the memory card got damaged. Rick stared at the notebook. He stared at it the way a man stares at something he has been afraid of for a long time and has finally unavoidably come face to face with. Then he looked up at Luke, and for one brief, unguarded second, the look on his face was not anger and not denial. It was something almost like bewilderment, the bewilderment of a man who had genuinely not believed that a 9-year-old could outmaneuver him and was only now absorbing the fact that one had. You've been stealing from me for 2 years, Luke said. His voice cracked on the last word, not with tears, but with the pressure of something that had been held down for a very long time and was finally being released through the valve of saying it out loud in front of witnesses to the person who had done it. My mom left that money for me. She worked her whole life for it. And you've been taking it, and you locked me in a shed, and you told me nobody would believe me, and you were wrong. His chin came up. You were wrong. Nobody at the table said anything. Nobody in the diner said anything. Millie had stopped pretending to dry the dish she was holding. The lumber workers were completely still. Even the child at the elderly woman's table had gone quiet, picking up the particular frequency of something important happening. Rick Holloway stood up. It was the wrong move, and he knew it the moment he did it, because every man at the table stood up at the same time, not moving toward him, just standing, creating a perimeter that was absolute and silent and completely clear in what it meant. Rick sat back down. This is not, he started. Stopped. Tried again. This is not how this works. You can't just, I'm his legal guardian. I have documentation. You have a lawyer you handpicked after the previous one retired, Karen said. She was writing something on a notepad now, not looking up. You have a trust account from which $64,000 has been transferred over 22 months into a separate LLC registered in Nevada under your name. You have a 9-year-old with 2 cracked ribs, a 4-month-old broken arm with no medical follow-up and documented evidence of being locked in an unheated structure. She looked up. And you have about 10 minutes before the detective I called gets here. I'd spend those 10 minutes very carefully, Mr. Holloway. The word detective landed in Rick's chest like a fist. You called. He turned to Bull, and now the performance was completely gone. What was underneath wasn't rage. It was something more desperate than that. You don't understand what you've done here. You've blown this completely out of proportion. He's a troubled kid. He needed structure. The money is being managed. I can show you the accounts. I can explain every single transfer. Then you'll have plenty to talk about, Dean said when the detective gets here. Rick looked around the table one more time, one last attempt to find a gap, an angle, a face that might be persuadable or uncertain. He found none. He found Bull, who was watching him without expression. He found Karen, who had gone back to writing. He found Doc Walsh, who was looking at Luke's ribs with the focused attention of a man building a medical record in his mind. He found Dean Stone, who was looking at him with the particular patience of someone waiting for an animal to finish running so they could close the gate. And he found Luke. Luke was looking at his uncle with that same steady, unreadable expression. But there was something new in it now, something that hadn't been there before tonight. Before the diner, before Bull nudged a booth seat open with his foot and gave a wet, shaking boy a place to sit. It was the expression of someone who had stopped waiting to be saved and had instead taken the first step towards saving themselves. It was, Bull thought, looking at the boy across the table, the most adult thing he'd ever seen on a child's face, and it broke his heart and filled him with something close to awe at the exact same time. Rick Holloway opened his mouth one more time. "Luke," he said, and his voice had dropped to something almost unrecognizable, quiet or stripped of performance, almost pleading. "You're my sister's son, whatever you think happened." "I know what happened," Luke said, "and now they know too." The diner door opened. A woman in a dark jacket stepped in, badge on her hip, moving with the direct efficiency of someone who had been briefed on the way over and needed no orientation. She looked at the table, looked at Rick, and looked at Karen, who gave her a small nod. Detective Sarah Vance had worked family crimes for 11 years. She had seen a lot of rooms that looked like this one, the particular arrangement of a situation that had reached its tipping point, where all the hidden architecture of an abuse case was suddenly finally visible above the surface. She walked to the table. She looked at Rick Holloway. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "I have some questions for you." Rick looked at her, then at Bull, then finally at Luke, one long last look at his 9-year-old nephew, who was sitting straight in a diner booth, surrounded by people who had decided each in their own way, and for their own reasons, that this boy was worth fighting for. Whatever Rick saw in Luke's face in that moment, it was enough. The last of the performance fell away completely. His shoulders dropped. His jaw went slack. And Rick Holloway, who had spent 2 years telling a child that no one would believe him, looked at the room full of people who believed him and said nothing at all. Luke turned back around in the booth. He picked up what was left of his chocolate milk. His hands, for the first time all evening, were completely still. Bull sat down across from him. He didn't say anything. He just picked up his coffee. Under the table, without looking at anyone, Luke pressed his good hand flat against the seat beside him, feeling the solidity of it, the realness of it, the simple fact of a place where he was allowed to be. He breathed in. He breathed out. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Detective Sarah Vance didn't sit down right away. She stood at the edge of the table and looked at Rick Holloway with the particular patience of someone who had done this enough times to know that the first 30 seconds of silence were often more productive than the first 30 minutes of questions. She let the silence do its work. Rick broke it first. "I want a lawyer," he said. "That's your right," Vance said, pulling out a chair and sitting down with the unhurried ease of someone who had just been handed exactly what she expected. "But I'm not here to arrest you tonight, Mr. Holloway. Not yet. I'm here to ask you some questions voluntarily. You are free to leave at any time." She paused. "Of course, if you leave, I'll have significantly fewer reasons to keep the conversation informal." Rick looked at her. He was doing the math, that particular frantic arithmetic of a man calculating exposure, calculating risk, calculating how much they already knew versus how much they were still fishing for. Karen looked up from her notepad. "The memory card is already in evidence," she said, as if reading his mind. "We retrieved it from the Larkspur 20 minutes ago." She said it the way you'd say the weather, matter of fact, no drama. "Petey picked it up while you were driving over here." Rick's head swiveled to the man by the wall. Petey gave him nothing. Not a smile, not a look of satisfaction. Just the blank, settled stillness of a man who had already completed his task and moved on. Rick turned back to Vance. "That evidence was obtained without... It was retrieved by an individual who rented the room legally with his own funds," Karen said. "There's no chain of custody issue. The room was paid for. The contents were retrieved by the person who stored them. She tilted her head. You're thinking like a lawyer, Mr. Holloway. That's good. Keep thinking like one because you're going to need to. The remaining color left Rick's face. Bull had moved slightly, not away from the table, but to the side of it, creating a clear line between where Luke was sitting and where Rick was sitting. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was the kind of repositioning that happens without announcement, the way a body just goes where it needs to go. Luke noticed it. He didn't say anything, but something in his shoulders released a degree of tension they'd been carrying since the moment his uncle walked through the door. Vance had opened a small recorder and set it on the table. Luke, she said, turning to the boy directly, I want you to know that you are not in any trouble. Nothing that happens in this conversation creates any problem for you. You understand? Luke nodded. I need you to say yes or no for the recorder. Yes, Luke said. Good. Vance looked at him with the particular directness that good investigators develop, not the softened, over-careful approach that some people used with children, which always felt like being handled but a straight-line respect. I've been briefed by Ms. Howell, but I want to hear it from you, in your own words. Can you tell me what happened the night of Thursday, November 7th? Luke took a breath. He set both hands flat on the table, the cast on the right, the thin, steady fingers of his left, and he began to talk. He talked for 11 minutes without stopping. His voice was even and measured the same voice he'd used with Karen, the same careful recitation of fact over feeling. He described finding the spreadsheet. He described copying the numbers into his notebook. He described taking the photographs with his uncle's old phone, transferring them to the memory card, renting the motel room, and hiding the envelope. He described the night his uncle found out. He described the shed. When he got to the shed, his voice didn't break, but it slowed. Each word came out more deliberate than the last, like he was lifting them one at a time. He said he'd let me out when I agreed to sign something, Luke said. A document that said I understood the trust was being managed correctly, and I had no concerns about it. He had it typed up. He slid it under the door. A pause. I didn't sign it. Vance was writing. She didn't look up. How long were you in the shed? From Thursday at about 9 at night until Friday at around noon, Luke said. When he opened the door to check, I went through it. He wasn't expecting me to run. I think he thought I'd be too scared. Luke's jaw moved. He was right about the scared part. He was wrong about what I'd do with it. Bull made a sound in the back of his throat. Not a word, just something that acknowledged what it had just heard. Rick had stopped looking at Luke entirely. He was staring at the table with the fixed, blank expression of a man who was watching everything he'd constructed very carefully over 2 years come apart at the joints in real time in public, with a recorder running. Mr. Holloway, Vance said, turning to him, the account transfers that appear on the memory card $64,000 over 22 months. Where did that money go? Rick said nothing. The LLC, registered in Nevada Holloway Asset Management, LLC, is currently active with a registered agent address in Las Vegas. Is that your company? Nothing. There are 3 properties listed under that LLC, 2 in Nevada, 1 in Arizona. Were those purchased with funds from your nephew's trust? Rick looked at his hands. Mr. Holloway. I want a lawyer, Rick said again. But this time it came out differently, not as a tactical move, but as a surrender. As someone finally letting go of a position they'd been defending, past the point where defending it made any sense. Vance clicked the recorder off. She looked at Rick without expression for a moment. Then she stood up and moved to the far side of the table, slightly away from Luke, and lowered her voice. I'm going to step outside and make a phone call, she said to Rick. When I come back in, we're going to have a different conversation than this one. I'd encourage you to spend the next 5 minutes thinking very carefully about what cooperation looks like versus what non-cooperation looks like, because those 2 roads have very different destinations. She looked at him steadily. I've been doing this for 11 years. Cases like this where the documentation is this clean, this complete, they go one of 2 ways. You either get in front of it or it gets in front of you. That's not a threat. That's arithmetic. She walked toward the diner door. Rick watched her go, and then his eyes moved involuntarily like he couldn't stop them to Luke. Luke was looking back at him. For a moment, the 2 of them just looked at each other across the table. The uncle and the nephew, the man who had spent 2 years betting on silence and smallness, and a child's inability to navigate the adult world, and the body who had spent 6 weeks quietly, methodically building the case that would dismantle him. Why, Rick said. It came out low and raw, not angry, not strategic, just the genuine bewilderment of a man confronting something he genuinely hadn't prepared for. You're 9 years old. How did you even... My mom taught me to keep records, Luke said. She kept a journal every single day. She said that writing things down was how you made sure the truth stayed true. His voice was even. I kept a journal too. Of everything. Rick closed his eyes. She would have hated you for this, Luke said. Not cruelly. Just as a fact stated plainly the way you'd state any fact you'd been sitting with for a long time. She trusted you. She put my name in a document and she put your name next to it and she trusted you and you... He stopped. His jaw worked. She loved you. And you did this anyway. Nobody at the table moved. Nobody spoke. The weight of what Luke had just said settled over the room like something physical. Rick Holloway pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead. And then in the back corner of a diner in November, surrounded by bikers and an investigator and a retired ER doctor and the detective who was going to end what was left of his freedom, Rick Holloway did something that nobody at the table had expected. He started to cry. Not performance, not strategy. Real tears, the kind that come from somewhere past pride, past calculation, past whatever a person has been using to insulate themselves from what they've done. They came out of him like something under pressure, finally finding its release valve. Luke watched his uncle cry for exactly 4 seconds. Then he looked away. I don't feel sorry for him, Luke said quietly to no one in particular. You don't have to, Bull said. Good, Luke said, because I don't. Doc Walsh, who had been quietly taking notes throughout all of it, leaned toward Luke and said in the gentle, practical tone of someone redirecting attention to what was actionable, I want to get you to a proper facility tonight. Get those ribs imaged, get that arm properly assessed. Are you okay with that? Luke looked at him. Will someone come with me? Doc Walsh glanced at Bull. Yeah, Bull said. Someone will come with you. Luke nodded. Okay. Vance came back through the door. She looked at Rick, who had pulled himself back together into something resembling composure but was not remotely convincing about it. She sat down and folded her hands on the table. I made my phone call, she said. Here's where we are. A warrant for your financial records has been requested. Given the documentation already in evidence, I expect it to be approved within the hour. She looked at him. I'm also in contact with the district attorney's office. They're very interested in the physical welfare component, the broken arm, the cracked ribs, the shed. She let that last word sit for a moment. The shed is going to be a significant conversation. Rick said nothing. His lawyer's instincts had apparently finally fully taken over. He'd stopped talking, and he wasn't starting again. Here's what I can tell you, Vance continued. If you voluntarily provide account information and cooperate with the financial audit, that is a factor that will be considered. It doesn't make anything disappear. But it is a factor. She paused. You have about 10 minutes to decide whether you'd like to cooperate before I make the next call, and cooperation stops being on the table. The diner was so quiet that the clock on the wall was audible. Tick, tick, tick. Luke had turned sideways in the booth, his back against the wall, his legs stretched out on the seat. He was holding his empty chocolate milk cup in his lap, turning it slowly in his hands. He looked for the first time all evening like a 9-year-old. Not a 9-year-old carrying a plan and a key tag and 4 days of survival, just a boy tired past the bone, sitting in a warm place that wasn't his home because he didn't have a home, turning a cup in his hands and waiting for the adults to finish deciding things. Bull watched him. Something had been building in Bull's chest all evening, since the moment the boy walked through the door and stood there dripping and unnoticed, since the 3 rejections, since the trembling leg, since the brass key tag on the table, and the careful columns of numbers in a child's handwriting, and it had been building quietly the way things build, in people who don't perform their feelings but feel them deeply anyway. He wasn't sure what to do with it yet, he just knew it was there. Dean Stone appeared at his shoulder quietly. He leaned down slightly and said, just for Bull, Karen's already been on the phone with the County Family Services emergency line. There's a crisis placement, a good one. She says a family who's been doing emergency care for 12 years. Clean record. Good people. He paused. But it's temporary. 30 days while the legal situation gets sorted. Bull nodded slowly. I also talked to Martinez, Dean said. He knows a family attorney, not a court-appointed one, a real one. Someone who does this kind of thing pro bono when the case warrants it. Another pause. This case warrants it. Bull was quiet for a moment. He was still watching Luke turn the cup in his lap. What are his options long-term? That's for the attorney to work out, Dean said. But Karen said with the guardianship being nullified, which it will be given everything and no other family on the mother's side, it likely goes to the state. Unless, Dean stopped. Unless what? Bull said. Dean was quiet for a beat. Unless someone files for emergency foster placement. Someone with a clean record in a stable situation who the court knows and trusts. He straightened up. I'm just telling you the landscape. You do what you want with it. Bull said nothing. He looked at the table. He looked at Luke. He looked at the brass key tag that was still sitting there slightly to the side, forgotten in the chaos of the last hour. That small, heavy battered piece of brass that a 9-year-old had carried through 4 days of cold and fear, because it was the only proof he had that the truth was real. Rick Holloway had started talking. Quietly to Vance, his voice stripped down to something flat and cooperative. And too late. Vance was writing. Karen had her tablet back out. The men around the table had shifted slightly, the crisis portion of the evening passing into the documentation portion, the adrenaline giving way to the slower, more permanent work of making the truth official. Bull reached over and picked up the key tag. He held it in his palm for a moment. Then he held it out to Luke. Luke looked at it, looked at Bull. Keep it, he said. It's yours, Bull said. I know. Luke looked at the key tag for another moment. But I don't need it anymore. He met Bull's eyes. It did what it was supposed to do. Bull closed his hand around the key tag. He held it, feeling the weight and the edges of it, the room number stamped into the brass, the letters of the motel name worn smooth at the corners. He thought about a woman he'd never met, a mother who'd kept journals and taught her son that writing things down was how you kept the truth true. He thought about what it cost her to leave and what it cost her son to stay. He put the key tag in his vest pocket. Doc Walsh is going to take you to get your ribs looked at, Bull said. And your arm, tonight. Luke nodded. I'm going to follow, Bull said, in case you need anything. Luke looked at him. Something moved in his face, not the controlled, careful expression of a boy managing his exposure, but something younger and less defended than that. Something that was still learning very carefully how to trust the ground it was standing on. You don't have to do that, Luke said. I know, Bull said. They looked at each other. Okay, Luke said very quietly. Vance looked up from her writing. She looked at Rick, who was still talking in a stripped-down cooperative monotone, and then she looked at Luke. Luke, I need you to understand something. What you did documenting the evidence, securing it, surviving 4 days on your own, and then walking into a room and asking for help, that's not something most adults would have the presence of mind to do. She said it plainly the way she said everything. You should know that. Luke looked at her for a moment. My mom used to say that being brave didn't mean you weren't scared, he said. It meant you did the thing even when you were scared. He paused. I was really scared. I know, Vance said. But I did it anyway, Luke said. Yeah, Vance said. You did. Doc Walsh stood up and touched Luke's shoulder gently, a brief, careful contact, asking permission in the gesture rather than in words. Ready? Luke slid out of the booth. He picked his crutch. He put his backpack on, carefully adjusting the broken strap. He stood up, and for a moment, he just stood there in the warmth of Millie's diner, 9 years old and 61 pounds, and cracked ribs and a 4-month-old cast and 4 days of survival behind him. He looked at Bull. Thank you, Luke said, for not making me sorry. Bull stood up. He looked down at this small, precise, exhausted, extraordinary boy, and he said, Don't thank me yet. We're not done. Luke blinked. What does that mean? Bull reached for his jacket on the booth seat. It means let's go get your arm looked at. He gestured toward the door with his chin. Doc Walsh started walking. Luke fell into step beside him. And Bull Davison walked 3 steps behind them, not crowding, not hovering, just present, just there the way he'd been since the boy first limped across a full diner to ask a dangerous-looking stranger for a place to sit. Millie watched them go from behind the counter. She pressed her dish towel to her mouth for a moment. Then she went to the cash register and very deliberately comped out every single item on Bull's ticket, the pie, The coffee, the burger, the fries, the chocolate milk. She drew a line through the total and wrote one word at the bottom of the receipt. Good. She put it in the drawer and went back to work. At the table in the back corner, Detective Vance was still writing. Karen was on the phone. Dean Stone sat with his hands folded, watching Rick Holloway unravel in the ordered, documented way of a man who had run out of road. And on the table next to the empty cup, in the closed notebook, in the ketchup that nobody had put away, there was nothing left of Luke Calloway except the small, damp outline where his backpack had rested on the vinyl seat. Outside, the night had gone cold and clear. The rain was done. The puddles on the sidewalk reflected the diner lights back up at the sky, bright and still and new. The county hospital was 20 minutes from Millie's diner, and Bull drove the entire way with his eyes on Doc Walsh's taillights and his mind on the boy in the passenger seat of Walsh's car. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. There was no more running tonight. The running was done. The ER at Clover County Medical was the kind of facility that operated on institutional patients. Fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic in old coffee, a waiting room where people sat with their injuries held close and their eyes far away. Doc Walsh had called ahead. A nurse met them at the entrance with the particular brisk efficiency of someone who had been briefed and didn't need to be told twice. Luke walked in under his own power. He had refused the wheelchair at the entrance the way a boy refuses things that make him feel like less than what he's trying to be. His crutch clicked on the hospital floor, and his jaw was set, and his eyes were taking in every exit, every face, every variable, the habit of a child who had learned that safety was something you assessed continuously, not something you were given once and got to keep. Bull walked beside him, not in front, not behind, beside. The nurse took them to a room and helped Luke onto the examination table. Luke sat on the edge of it with his backpack in his lap, still holding it, still not ready to put it down. Bull pulled a chair up to the side of the table and sat. He didn't say anything. He just put his forearms on his knees and was there. A young doctor came in, mid-30s, dark circles under his eyes, the particular exhausted competence of someone at the end of a long shift who still cared. He looked at Luke's arm. He felt along the cast with careful hands asking questions in a low, measured voice. Luke answered each one directly. Yes, it hurt here. No, not there. Yes, since July. When the doctor said, we're going to need to re-break this before we recast it, and Luke's face went very still. Bull leaned forward and said, it'll be quick, and I'll be right here. Luke looked at him. You promise? Bull held his gaze. Yeah, I promise. Luke nodded once and looked back at the doctor. Okay, he said, do it. The imaging came first. The x-ray confirmed what Doc Walsh had suspected: 2 cracked ribs on the right side, both old, both healing wrong because nobody had addressed them when they should have. The arm was worse. The original break had shifted slightly during the 4 months without proper care, which meant the re-break was not optional. When the orthopedic resident explained this to Luke in careful, simple language, Luke listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and then asked 3 specific questions about recovery time, long-term mobility, and whether it would affect his ability to write. The resident blinked. Your ability to write? I keep records, Luke said. It's important. The resident looked at Bull. Bull looked at the wall. He was doing the thing again, the thing where his face tried to stay neutral and was not entirely succeeding. They took Luke to prep for the procedure, and for the first time in hours, Bull was alone in a waiting room with a cup of bad coffee and the brass key tag in his vest pocket, in the particular silence of a man who has made a decision but hasn't said it out loud yet. His phone buzzed. Dean. How's the kid? They're fixing his arm, Bull said. Ribs are cracked. Old injuries. A pause on Dean's end. Karen finished it with Vance. The financial documentation is solid. They're pursuing charges fraud breach of fiduciary child neglect. Another pause. They added a 4th count tonight. What 4th count? Bull asked. Unlawful imprisonment, Dean said. For the shed. His voice was flat and steady. DA's office moved faster than expected. They're treating it as a priority case. Bull was quiet. There's something else, Dean said. The attorney Martinez connected us with Jessica Park. She does child advocacy work. She pulled the trust documents tonight. Bull. Dean stopped. The trust isn't 240,000 anymore. How much is it? Bull asked. After Rick's withdrawals, it's about 176,000, Dean said. But Jessica says the Nevada LLC, the properties he bought, those are assets subject to recovery. If the civil case runs parallel to the criminal case and the recovery order goes through, Luke gets it back, all of it, with interest, potentially. Dean paused. The kid is not going to be without resources. That's what I'm telling you. Bull exhaled slowly. Also, Dean said, and his voice shifted into something more careful. Jessica wants to talk to you tomorrow morning. She said when Dean Stone calls and says it's about a kid, she clears her calendar. A pause. She's expecting you to want to talk about more than just a legal case. Bull said nothing for a moment. He turned the key tag over in his palm. She's good. She's the best I know, Dean said, and she's not going to ask you questions you're not ready to answer. She's just going to lay out the options. Okay, Bull said. Bull. Dean's voice softened by a degree that was barely perceptible but completely real. You did a good thing tonight. I gave a kid a seat, Bull said. Yeah, Dean said. And look what that turned into. The call ended. Bull sat with his coffee and his key tag and the sound of the hospital around him. He thought about his daughter in Sacramento, who was 31 now, and slowly, carefully letting him back into her life after years of distance that he'd earned by being exactly the kind of absent, unreliable presence that a child shouldn't have to grow up around. He thought about the conversation they'd had 3 months ago, where she'd said, Dad, I don't need you to fix what happened. I just need you to be different now. And he'd said, I'm working on it. And she'd said, I know. That's why we're having this conversation. He thought about what it meant to be different now. Not in the abstract, in the specific daily concrete sense of showing up for something small and letting it become something large. He was still thinking when the nurse came to get him. Luke was in recovery, not surgical recovery, just the slow coming back to yourself recovery of a child who had been through too much in a single day and needed time and quiet, and the specific knowledge that nobody was going to ask anything else of him for a little while. His arm was in a fresh white cast, his ribs were wrapped. He had an IV in his good arm that was putting fluids and pain medication into him at a rate that was finally slowly convincing his body to relax the vigilance it had been running on for 4 days. He was awake when Bull came in, barely but awake. Hey, Bull said. Hey, Luke said. His voice was blurred at the edges. Bull sat down in the chair beside the bed. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the boy, at the white cast, the wrapped ribs showing under the edge of the hospital gown, the face that was finally, for the first time all evening, simply tired. Not braced, not calculating. Just tired the way children are supposed to be tired at the end of a long day when they are finally somewhere safe. Your uncle's being charged, Bull said. Multiple counts, it's official. Luke processed this from somewhere behind the medication's soft buffer. Okay, he said. The trust is recoverable, Bull said. Most of it. A lawyer named Jessica Park is working on it. She's good. Okay, Luke said again. You're going to be placed with a family tonight, Bull said. Emergency foster, good people. Karen checked them herself. Luke's eyes, which had been half closed, opened slightly. Tonight? Yeah, once the hospital clears you. Probably a few hours. Luke looked at the ceiling. His good hand was resting on the blanket, the IV line running from the back of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've been in foster care before. 2 placements before my uncle took guardianship. Bull waited. The first family was okay, Luke said. The second one, he stopped. His jaw tightened slightly. It wasn't as bad as my uncle, but it wasn't good either. He paused. I'm tired of being somewhere that isn't mine. The words landed in Bull's chest and didn't leave. I know, Bull said. I just want somewhere that's mine, Luke said. His voice was still blurred, but underneath the blur, the feeling was precise and clean and entirely real. Somewhere I can put my stuff down and not have to think about whether I'm going to have to pick it back up. Bull was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the key in his palm. He'd taken it out of his pocket without thinking about it, was holding it the way you hold something that anchors you. Luke, he said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear it clearly. Not as a promise, and not as a done thing, just as a question. Okay, Luke turned his head on the pillow and looked at Bull. If it were up to you, Bull said, what would safe look like? Luke blinked. Nobody had ever asked him that. In 2 years of enduring and 1 year of planning, in 4 days of running, and this one extraordinary evening of being found, nobody had ever asked him to define in his own terms what he was looking for. They had placed him and moved him and assessed him and documented him, and the entire system had operated on its own definition of what was good for him without ever turning to him and saying, what do you need? What does it look like when you have it? His eyes got bright. He blinked it back down. Quiet, he said finally. Somewhere quiet, where nobody's angry all the time. He paused. Somewhere with a desk, so I can keep my records. Another pause smaller, and a dog would be okay. I've always wanted to do. Bull looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, I have a dog. Luke stared at him. What? His name is Hatch. He's a 4-year-old shepherd mix. He's ugly as sin, and he eats things he's not supposed to, and he won't sleep anywhere except on the couch. Bull paused. He's also the most patient animal I've ever encountered. He would not bother you. Luke's expression had changed. He was very still. Why are you telling me that? Because I have a meeting tomorrow morning, Bull said, with the attorney, and I want to know if you're okay with that meeting happening. Because it's about you and nothing goes forward on anything without you knowing about it and agreeing to it. He held Luke's gaze. I'm not making decisions for you. I'm asking if you want me in your corner for the next part. That's all. The monitor beside the bed beeped steadily. Down the hall, someone was being paged. The hospital kept its ordinary pace around them, indifferent to the fact that something significant was being decided in a recovery room at 11:43 on a Tuesday night in November. Luke's good hand moved on the blanket. His fingers found the edge of it and held on. You'd have to get approved, Luke said slowly. For fostering, they do background checks. I know, Bull said. You have a record? Luke said. I didn't ask, but I kind of figured. From my 20s, Bull said. It's sealed. Karen already looked into it. It's not disqualifying. Luke absorbed this. You already had her look into it. After Dean told me about the options, Bull said. Yeah. When was that? About an hour ago, Bull said. Luke looked at him. You decided in an hour. I'd been thinking about it since about 40 minutes after you sat down, Bull said. Luke was quiet for a long time. His hand was still gripping the blanket edge. The medication was pulling at him, trying to take him under, but he was holding on to consciousness with the same stubborn, deliberate grip he'd used to hold on to everything else. Why, he asked. The same question he'd asked in the diner. The one Bull had answered with, because you asked. But this time, Bull answered differently. He leaned forward and set his elbows on his knees and looked at this 9-year-old boy, this precise, exhausted, brilliant, broken, and unbroken boy, and he said the true thing. Because I had someone turn their back on me once when I was young, and I needed someone not to, he said. And I spent a long time being angry about it, and then I spent a long time trying to be the kind of person who wouldn't do that to someone else. He paused. I'm not perfect. I've got edges and I've got a past and I don't know how to do everything right. But I know how to show up and I know how to stay. His voice was steady. And you deserve someone who stays. Luke looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were very bright. He was blinking more than normal. His hand on the blanket edge had gone white at the knuckle. Okay, he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. Okay, Bull said. Okay, Luke said again, firmer this time. Go to the meeting. Bull nodded once. He straightened up in his chair. He put the key tag on the bedside table where Luke could see it, and he settled back into his chair and didn't move. He was staying. Luke closed his eyes. For the first time in 2 years, possibly longer, he let himself close his eyes in a room with another person in it and not immediately start cataloging exits. He just let his eyes close and his breathing slow, and the medication and the warmth and the exhaustion take him down into sleep. Bull sat with him while he slept. Somewhere around 1 a.m, Bull's phone buzzed with a message from his daughter in Sacramento. She'd seen something on her social media feed, a brief mention of an incident at a local diner. Bikers, child authorities. The story was sparse and incomplete, the way early reports always were. She'd put the pieces together anyway, the way she always put pieces together. She knew her father. The message said, I heard what you did tonight. I'm proud of you, Dad. Bull read it twice. He put the phone away. He looked at the sleeping boy in the bed and at the white cast on his arm and at the brass key tag on the table catching the low light of the hospital room. He thought about the question Luke had answered back in the diner, the one nobody had ever asked him before. What does safe look like? And the answer the boy had given quieted a desk a dog. Something that's mine. Bull reached into his vest pocket and closed his hand around nothing. The key tag was on the table now. He unclenched his hand and spread his fingers on his knee and sat with the simplicity of the next thing that had to happen. One meeting, one attorney, one clear-eyed step in the direction he had already decided to walk. The hospital clock moved past 2 in the morning. Luke slept deeply and without flinching, his body finally fully surrendering to the safety that his mind had not yet fully learned to trust. That would come. Not all at once, not without difficulty, not without the long work of slowly reprogramming every alarm that 2 years of fear had installed in him. But it would come, because the truth was already official, the evidence was already in hand. The man who had bet everything on a child's silence had lost, and a 9-year-old boy who kept records and believed in writing things down had walked into a diner on a Tuesday evening with nothing except a brass key tag and a trembling leg and the courage to ask one stranger one question. And the stranger had said yes. That was where it started. That was where everything started, not with the lawyers, not with the investigation, not with the charges or the warrant or the courtroom that was still waiting down the road. It started with a booth and a nudged foot and 2 words that asked nothing back. Sit down. Some people would say it was luck that Luke happened to cross the room to the right man, that Bull happened to be the kind of person who happened to still care, that the whole thing balanced on a coincidence that could have gone the other way just as easily. But that was not the true shape of it. The true shape of it was this: a boy who refused to stop believing that someone somewhere would see him, and a man who had spent 20 years becoming the person who finally did. In the morning, Jessica Park would sit across from Bull Davidson at a coffee shop 2 blocks from her office, and she would ask him a series of careful practice questions, and he would answer each one directly and without performance, the way he did everything. She would look at him across the table at the end of it and say, "Mr. Davidson, in my experience, the best placements aren't the ones where everything is perfect. They're the ones where someone just refuses to quit." She would pause. "Are you someone who refuses to quit?" And Bull would look at the key tag on the table between them because he had brought it, because it felt like the right thing to bring, because it was the object that had started everything, and it deserved to be present at the thing that was going to continue it. And he would say simply, "Ask the kid." She would smile. She would open her folder. And the next part of Luke Calloway's life would begin, not with a rescue, not with a miracle, with something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. With a man who sat down, showed up, and stayed. With a boy who had been invisible to a room full of people and had found in the one unlikely corner of it the one person who looked back. With the radical, ordinary, world-altering act of one human being saying to another, "I see you. I'm not going anywhere. You are not alone." That was the whole of it. That was all of it. That was everything.